Released in 2008, Banjo-Kazooie Nuts and Bolts was the first Banjo-Kazooie game in over a decade, and it lets you know about that almost instantly. The antiquated obsession with collection is led out the back and shot through a pastiche of Rare's old platformer design, but more than anything else, it makes me wonder how difficult it must be to create this kind of satire in a video game. Never again does it draw a crowd of collectible objects like this. Spoofing an entire gameplay system requires making it to a certain level of polish in an engine that, at least technically, has no desire to perform this way in any other circumstance. The goofy scene makes a mockery of its dated running and jumping, but what should be a brief gag goes on for so long it feels like the self-deprecation is less tongue-in-cheek than maybe it's supposed to be. On top of that, the dialogue is ironically hamstrung by the awkwardly paced text delivery of the previous games, so when it's scattered among brief interludes of what the player will soon discover is extraneous material, the satirical take on tropes the game often uses itself is questionable. Promptly following this is the introduction of the actual game that centers around vehicle construction, but its placement before the player is ever told why they'd want to do anything of the sort only serves to confuse them. I think the cartoonish take on construction requires some kind of explanation, but embroiling it in exposition makes anyone's first moments with the game crudely top-heavy. By gently ribbing out an audience's perception of what it could have been, instead of starting with what it actually is, the player is provoked into disliking a clearly unique game. There isn't much out there with an emphasis on freewheeling construction like there is in Nuts and Bolts, which seems especially tragic when you consider actual fans of the franchise dismiss it as a blithe departure from previous entries, choked by its vacuous disregard for a more classical formula. Once the player throws away their expectations and escapes the red tutorial boxes though, the mechanical intricacies of building vehicles becomes instantly appealing. Blocks, wheels, and engines arise in most of what is possible, so the recreation of common transportation types in the real world is easily achievable. There's certainly a Lego-like quality to slapping together elemental pieces in the pursuit of a grand idea, making building not necessarily about stringent design. Tools that only enable sticking one thing onto another force you to instead think of building in the general direction of what you want. The builder is capably prudent in guessing those initial generic creations, which is important because while adding prefabricated objects together can be limiting to some people, an entirely blank canvas is bewildering to almost everyone. The game recognizes that a complex toolset has a high chance of confronting the player with concepts and practices they don't want to learn, so building the simplest ideas is made to be mindless. Simply placing items together by sight provides you with the rudimentary function expected out of that visual expression. The game's logic is based in a colloquial idea of reality. If you know what a car is, putting 4 wheels and an engine together makes those parts operate like one. This is facilitated by exploring the hub world, Showdown Town, in which the vehicle creator itself is attached. By finding crates and returning them here, the player unlocks additional parts. But seeing as you can only drive a slow cart that only receives upgrades from beating boss battles, learning to make do with your impoverished collection in the meantime owns those skills considerably. Anything beyond even a moderate degree of specificity is eked out only if the player is willing to tinker for a long time, and comes about largely through conscious manipulation of the physics engine. You stop creating vehicles the game takes from you and makes functional according to these rules, and begin to exploit your understanding of how the game actually does that. Being aware of how the amount and placement of materials affects their collective behavior allows you to construct more focused designs with nothing but the most tenuous basis in reality. But focus doesn't necessarily make for the best efficiency. While more powerful parts are obviously useful, they take up more space in increasingly awkward fashions. The brute force agglomeration makes your vehicles everlasting prototypes. You might build a helicopter for moving around tight spaces, but it quickly becomes a mesa of trays for carrying objects, or turns into a hovering box that acts as a shield. Since the means to do any of this are as complicated as moving an object around on a grid and placing it, there is seemingly no permanence to anything you make. Everything built is in a constant state of adjustment and altered specification. The iterative building process means more than once I stared at the vehicle creator for over 30 minutes. Not because I couldn't easily have beaten a mission, but because I could do it better by mixing new materials with my old stuff. This philosophy of permitting unpredictability within austere limits is extended to the missions themselves. Every goal within a level is bluntly enumerated by a menu, stalling the player and causing them to think about how they'll attack a particular issue. Crucially though, what's put into writing before starting and the following interim of player action never talk to each other. So long as you adhere to the letter of the law, its spirit is openly interpretable. A systemic application of physics to anything that's not level geometry means Nuts and Bolts has the goal to not care what you do to it. Shamelessly contrived freedom gives the player a chance to adapt the way in which they navigate a space. The initial state of freely exploring a level provides basic spatial knowledge of the landmass itself, and allows you to build the beginnings of vehicles that will succeed on the terrain. The contrasting mayhem within a mission escalates the importance of player action. The presence of a score or time limit requires a vehicle that can carry out a task consistently well, highlighting what elements of them need to be focused on. Designing vehicles is a trial by fire process that makes not succeeding fun. Feeding broken ideas into one another until you get something that kinda works, then getting a better idea out of that mess and building it from scratch, creates a stop and start relationship between making and using that feed into one another perfectly. Importantly though, the brazen simplicity of what you make frees the physics engine to do as it wishes. With a few meters and a keen eye, it adheres to the general idea of how your creations should control, obfuscating highly circumstantial physics calculations, and adding a light layer of predictability to unfettered madness. But as a necessity, this mechanical irreverence is also content to let you wallow in anguish, providing beyond size, no overt barriers in terms of construction, and never really stepping in to block the extremities of its possibility space. If you really want to build something that performs equally as possible on land, water, and air, and can attack, defend, push, and pull, you'll eventually accumulate enough parts to do so, and there's nothing really stopping you. A brute force solution with 12 motors is entirely acceptable, although there is no point where your emporium of physics trinkets don't feel as if they are on the verge of your control, and things can spiral out of it almost immediately. What's so utterly confounding then is that occasionally the game will require you to use a specific, non-player made vehicle. By providing only a singular way of completing something, the game denounces the mirth inherent in its exposed foundations. Revoking the possibility for broken ideas permits static, boring failure, and it couldn't be more antithetical to the way the game's systems are built. Thankfully, similar mission types across new spaces strain your vehicles and force the player to change their established building techniques, meaning it's never entirely up to you to be actually as creative as you think you are. A point that couldn't be made clearer by those neatly trimmed vehicles that reject the personal motivation created by your dumb box on wheels. Rewarding the player for their efforts is placed under the same dichotomy of physical awareness and prompt execution. Collecting jiggies, the most common item given for completing a task, is done by rolling your cart up to a dispenser in the hub world and then driving the jiggies back to the town center. Only then do they actually count as being collected. When doing this, the AI will try and hunt you down, showing a frustrating irreverence towards your teetering grasp on the physics engine. Unless you're incredibly patient, you'll likely want to bring back everything from a dispenser in one go, which in and of itself is challenging. Maneuvering the slow, crude trolley over roughly hewn terrain is enjoyably difficult. But interrupting this process by unceremoniously slamming police into you constitutes a needless tedium. It makes sense to have an external threat in a mission because doing so provides the reward of progression. You do the thing, you get the shiny, and you move forward. But the pigs are easily the hardest enemies in the game, and serve no purpose other than stalling the act of making something you've already earned actually count. Otherwise, Showdown Town is a comfortable escape from the mayhem of the main levels, and allows the player to upgrade their character on foot when they're tired of building. There's a clear division between creating vehicles, beating missions, and placidly collecting crates, but all three guide the player to enact their own agency in different ways. While the introduction of Nuts and Bolts' sprawling vistas parody old TV shows in a supposedly charming way, I'm way too young and not British to appreciate them, unfortunately. A nonchalant audio mix and the immense amount of space between NPCs gives the feeling that you're utterly alone in these quaint worlds. Since the game is freely explorable, it can't settle for an illusion of scale. Allowing the player to openly manipulate how they roam about means levels have to permit a vast amount of different approaches. When the challenge of the game revolves entirely around the act of movement, being able to speed past or fly over whatever it may place in your way means the scorched earth design has to confront your vehicles holistically. While a car geared for speed is great in levels with large horizontal expanses, taller environments with a restrictive width are far more difficult to navigate in the same way. Regardless, the thematic drapery hanging off these vast levels is rendered to such a high degree of fidelity that they appear fake to the player, largely because they appear intentionally so within the virtual world itself. Rare smartly used a patchwork motif to literally hold together otherwise completely disparate elements. But when you remember that all of these levels are connected via a hub world, the candor presentation of its artifice highlights the surprising level of similarity Nuts and Bolts has to the original Banjo-Kazooie. Vehicles become faster and stronger through the acquisition of additional parts. Just like the platforming Banjo learns how to double jump, backflip, run faster, and fly from increasingly harder to find molehills. Both games expand a player's mobility the more their existing abilities are practiced. The first Banjo-Kazooie does this by demanding a structurally diverse method of navigation from its discrete moveset, and it can do so because the game was designed around and played with this madness. If you get past the fact that you're supposed to hold the Nintendo 64 controller like it's a hot slice of pizza, you'll find that while there's only 4 main buttons that are comfortable to press, there's also these, the C buttons. Since the C buttons are small and a little awkward to press quickly without looking, Banjo-Kazooie maps them to the camera as well as actions that are dependent on other buttons, or in other words, gives them moves that can afford to be performed slowly. For example, hitting Z makes the player crouch, so moves dependent on pressing it and then a C button are based off of the root motion of crouching, but don't necessarily deepen the individual movement of crouching itself. It remains a dependable, static action that forces you to stop and is nothing more. No other controller can proficiently replicate this wide swath of bespoke controls, so playing Banjo-Kazooie on Xbox is appropriately weird. While the 360 controller has enough buttons, it's not built for the shallow specificity admitted by whatever the hell that is. Contrarily, Nuts and Bolts diminishes the player's competence at accessing an array of abilities in real time. Not only does the constant necessity to accelerate make a vehicle's numerous eccentricities secondary to motion, but what those modifiers can actually be aren't automatically suitable to the demands of a mission. However, removing that precise capability and asking the player to substitute it themselves only comes about because the physics that govern such actions are far more complex. Discovering the most enjoyable methods of poking at this inscrutable machine is a puzzle of control there are infinite solutions for. And it's here where the series' technological underpinnings become easier to see. The wide gap in graphical capability between the Nintendo 64 and the Xbox 360 is obvious, and arguably compromises the visual design of Nuts and Bolts as a result. While small touches like the patchwork imagery give a physical justification for abstract environments, they are clearly derived from the flat, simple polygons that take advantage of fast cartridge loading speeds. The new game feels as if an entrenched design had technological prowess poured over it, but seemingly in spite of a best effort to present itself otherwise. The introduction may appear as an oddly executed but gentle ribbing of its origins, but it extends into an ever-present sequence of self-loathing. Nuts and Bolts was released into the world in a shitty mood. The game's mission text consists of functional satire, as long as you have a decent understanding of video game industry politics, but it's funny in the way that someone who's unconscionably racist is. You're disturbed by the absurdity of the fact it exists, not the actual content. So if you take the game as it presents itself, which is to say confusedly, and allow yourself to be disappointed in what the game could never be under the iron grip of a large publisher, you'll obsess over the basic ideas of a traditional platformer embedded in the game's core. But if you accept the sentiment that movement itself is the joy of these games, it's wild in a way that feels, weirdly enough, as if it's barely holding together.